At first, they thought it was a mirage, a shimmer above the hedgerows, a flicker beyond the coastal haze. Then came the sound, low at first, like distant surf. But it rose quickly, boiling into a roar that shook window panes and made birds scatter inland. Thousands of engines, synchronized like a single heartbeat. Then the sky turned silver. Not from clouds, not from sun, but from wings. Wings with teeth. June 7th, 1944. Less than 24 hours after Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The sand was still red in places. Dead paratroopers hung from trees. Smoke curled from the ruins of Caen and Carentan. And while the German 7th Army reeled from the landings, a second assault came from the sky. More than 1,000 P-51 Mustangs swept in from England in the largest coordinated fighter operation of the Western Front. It wasn't a bombing run. It wasn't an escort. It was a strike. An intentional, overwhelming strike designed to paralyze, disorient, and destroy. German officers watching from occupied towns didn't understand at first. The radar stations picked up hundreds of contacts, too many to count. Airfields in Belgium tried to respond, but communication lines were jammed or cut. The Luftwaffe scrambled what it could, but the sky was already lost. The Mustangs came low, fast, and everywhere at once. They weren't hunting dogfights. They weren't challenging the enemy. They were eliminating him. Rail lines were severed in minutes. Trains loaded with panzer reinforcements exploded mid-track, their cargo tossed across fields like broken toys. Convoys of fuel trucks vanished into columns of fire. Bridges were collapsed into rivers, leaving entire regiments stranded. Command cars, staff vehicles, even motorcycles. Nothing moving was spared. This was not the air war of 1940. This was something new. German soldiers who had once cheered Messerschmitts now dove into ditches as Mustang engines screamed overhead. French villagers emerged from cellars to watch the sky change sides. Allied ground forces, pushing inch by inch from the beaches, looked upward and felt for the first time in years what it meant to own the air. The Luftwaffe tried. They sent FW-1190s and Bf-109s, led by ace pilots who had survived the Eastern Front, the Channel, even North Africa. But the response was scattered, improvised, and the Mustangs were ready. Dogfights lit the sky in spirals of smoke and flame. But the numbers were not equal. For every German fighter launched, 5 Mustangs circled above it. Drop tanks gave them range. Discipline gave them formation. And American industry had given them numbers the Germans could no longer match. In less than 6 hours, nearly 200 German aircraft were destroyed. By dusk, Allied tanks were rolling forward with uninterrupted air cover. By midnight, the entire German defensive posture in northern France had been shattered, not just by boots on sand, but by wings above the clouds. In Berlin, the high command demanded explanations. Why had reinforcements not arrived? Why were tanks sitting idle without fuel? Why were roads impassable, rail lines gone, airfields burning? The answer was simple: the sky. And in Moscow, they watched. Soviet intelligence had agents embedded in every Allied command. Radio intercepts, frontline dispatches, aerial photography. Reports flooded eastward like stormwater. Stalin read them carefully. He had always distrusted the Western Allies, their delays, their diplomacy, their promises. But now, in black and white, he saw something that no Soviet general could ignore. 1,000 fighters, one day, one sky. He had seen massed aviation before, over Kursk, over Stalingrad. But never like this. Never this coordinated, this sustained, this total. This wasn't air support. This was air dominance, used as a surgical instrument. And it worked. The Western Front, once theory and negotiation, had become real. And the Germans, the same Wehrmacht that had driven to the Volga, that had shattered armies across the steppe, were now breaking not because of tanks or artillery, but because their roads burned and their trains never arrived. The sky had become a weapon, and the Americans had fired it first. Stalin said nothing in public, but in private, he made notes, on airfields, on engine design, on strategic depth. Because Normandy had revealed a new truth. Victory would not belong only to the side that held the ground. It would belong to the side that held the air above it. The sky had turned silver, and it changed the war forever. The P-51 Mustang was never meant to become a legend. In fact, it wasn't even meant to be American. In 1940, with Europe already ablaze and Britain gasping for survival, the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation with a desperate request. Build us fighters, fast, cheap, now. The Americans promised a prototype in 120 days. They delivered it in 102. What followed was an evolution no one expected. The first Mustangs were decent. Fast at low altitudes, stable, heavily armed. But it wasn't until someone bolted a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to its frame that the aircraft became something else entirely. It became deadly at altitude. It could fly faster, climb higher, dive harder, and, most crucially, escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. That changed everything. Until then, American bomber crews flew into occupied Europe, knowing that once they passed the Rhine, they were alone. B-17s and B-24s flew in tight boxes, relying on mutual machine gun fire to fend off German interceptors. It was noble, it was brave, and it was a slaughter. The Luftwaffe fed on unescorted bomber formations. Some missions lost 30% of their aircraft. Pilots called it riding the flaming coffin. Gunner crews wrote names on their bombs, but rarely saw them land. The German sky was a gauntlet, and Allied crews walked it without a sword. Then came the Mustang. Slim, elegant, and long-legged, it could fly at 400 miles per hour, stay aloft for 8 hours with drop tanks, and carry 6 50 caliber machine guns. It wasn't just an escort, it was a hunter. And the Luftwaffe, once dominant, found itself suddenly prey. In 1943, the 8th Air Force tested Mustangs in limited numbers. The results were immediate. Bomber losses dropped. Enemy kills rose. Morale shifted. By early 1944, the Mustangs were everywhere. They didn't just fly alongside the bombers. They flew ahead of them, clearing the skies, roaming across France, Belgium, the Low Countries, strafing trains, trucks, airfields, shooting down fighters before they could even scramble. They cut the Luftwaffe's legs out from under it, not just tactically, but industrially. German aircraft factories were bombed during the day. Repair yards hit at night. Fuel plants turned into smoldering craters. And even when the bombers turned back toward England, the Mustangs stayed behind, loitering over German territory, looking for anything that moved. They called it the fighter sweep. To the Germans, it felt like a noose tightening around the Reich. In one 2-month span in early 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,600 aircraft. Not over battlefields, but over their own soil. Aces who had survived years of war, men like Walter Nowotny, Egon Mayer, and Heinrich Ehrler, were shot down by 20-year-olds from Kansas and Brooklyn and Idaho. Somewhere over Hanover, over Dresden, over Leipzig, the air war turned. Not in one moment, but in 1,000 duels, 1,000 kills, 1,000 Mustang engines growling through cloud and smoke and flak. To the Americans, the P-51 became a symbol of invincibility. To the Germans, it became a harbinger of collapse. Even Hitler took notice. In meetings with his air marshals, he demanded to know why Germany's once proud Luftwaffe was losing the sky. His generals blamed fuel shortages, pilot fatigue, sabotage, weather. But the truth was simple, and everyone in the room knew it. The Americans had built a better plane, and they had built too many of them. The Soviet Union watched this with quiet intensity. Though the Red Air Force had fought vicious battles over Kursk and the Don, their fighters, like the Yak-3 and La-5, were optimized for lower altitudes and shorter ranges. They were agile, fearless, and flown by veterans. But they were regional aircraft. The Mustang was strategic. It reached from England to Berlin, from Tunisia to Naples, from Normandy to Prague. It made geography irrelevant. And that was a threat not just to the Nazis, but to anyone watching from the sidelines. In Moscow, Air Marshal Novikov studied the flight reports. Soviet engineers examined captured Mustangs with a mix of admiration and frustration. Their construction was light, their fuel systems efficient, their range astonishing. The Mustang had no counterpart in the USSR, not yet. But Stalin understood what it meant. The Americans had developed a weapon that didn't just win battles, it shaped the battlefield itself. By the time the Normandy invasion began, the Luftwaffe had already been mortally wounded. Not by tanks, not by paratroopers, but by aluminum wings, 6 guns, and a Merlin roar in the cold, high air. What came on June 7th was not the beginning. It was the consequence. 1,000 Mustangs over Normandy wasn't a surprise. It was a statement, the final act of an air campaign that had already rewritten the laws of war. And the message, written in contrails across a blue French sky, was unmistakable. The Reich no longer owned the air. He read the reports in silence, typed on gray paper, translated by trusted clerks, flown in from embassies and listening posts and agents buried in the West like seeds in foreign soil. The words were cold, factual, military. But between the lines, Stalin read something else. The Allies had changed the game. Normandy had been a success, not a bloodless one. No, the beaches had drunk their fill, but a breakthrough. The Western Allies had finally opened the long-promised Second Front. And they had done it not just with ships and tanks, but with aircraft in numbers the Red Army had never seen. Stalin marked the passages personally. Over 1,000 American fighters used in pre-dawn strike. German reinforcements unable to move during daylight hours. Fighter sweeps reaching as far as Paris within 72 hours of landing. He underlined one phrase 3 times. Complete Allied air dominance. It was what the Soviet generals had long dreamed of over the Eastern Front, and what they had bled for. But here, on the Western Front, the Americans had achieved it with speed, precision, and a kind of mechanical brutality the Soviets both respected and feared. He called a meeting. Marshal Zhukov, Air Marshal Novikov, Molotov, Beria. No interpreters, no stenographers. The doors closed, and the map of Europe came alive. Stalin gestured to France. "They've done it," he said simply. Zhukov nodded. "Yes, Comrade Stalin." "And the Luftwaffe?" "Crippled. Our latest estimates suggest fewer than 400 operational fighters in the Western Theater. Their losses from Mustangs alone." He paused. "Devastating." Stalin lit his pipe. The smoke curled like thought. "Are we surprised?" No one answered, because they weren't. For months, Soviet intelligence had reported massive American construction projects, new airfields in England, rail lines flooded with fuel and bombs, strange long-range fighter squadrons practicing low-level strafing runs across southern counties. The preparations had been obvious, but the scale? That was something else entirely. Stalin exhaled smoke, then turned his gaze to the east, to his own skies. The Red Air Force had won victories, over Moscow, over Kursk, over Berlin, eventually, but always through attrition, sacrifice, courage soaked in gasoline and blood. Soviet aircraft were improving, faster, stronger, more resilient, but they lacked what the Mustang represented: reach. The Americans could now fly from England to Berlin, to Paris, to the Alps, strike, refuel, and return. They could choose the time, the altitude, the battlefield. They could dictate the terms of air war. It was not just a tactical shift, it was strategic freedom. And Stalin understood what that meant, not just for the war, but for the peace that would follow. He leaned over the table and tapped a finger on Poland. "They will push fast after Normandy," he said. "They will want territory." Molotov responded carefully. "They claim only to liberate France." Stalin smiled, a hard, narrow smile. "They always claim something." Then came the real question, the one Stalin asked not out loud, but with a glance to Beria. "What happens when their planes fly over our cities? The Allies were partners now, but war made all alliances temporary, and air power, real, far-reaching air power, was not just about defeating Nazis. It was about position, influence, leverage at negotiation tables. The Americans could now project power across Europe in a way the Soviet Union could not. Not yet. It had taken the USSR years to push the Germans out by land, inch by inch, town by ruined town. The Mustang had done in weeks what Soviet aircraft could not, silenced the Luftwaffe almost completely. Zhukov cleared his throat. "We must accelerate jet development." Novikov nodded. "The Yak and Lavochkin projects are progressing, but we need time." Stalin looked again at the reports. One noted the average age of an American fighter pilot, 21. Another mentioned that some units had been trained, deployed, and rotated out in less than 6 months. Mass production, mass deployment, mass replacement, an army of engines and youth, and the Americans had barely begun. The Red Army would reach Berlin first. Stalin would make sure of it. But he understood now that it would be a race, not just of tanks and men, but of aircraft. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray, stood, and spoke without looking up. "Begin preparations, quietly." No one needed to ask what he meant. More airfields, more fuel reserves, more aircraft maintenance crews, and more observers sent to study every Mustang, every escort pattern, every bombing report. The Americans had shown their hand, and Stalin intended to memorize it. He would fight Hitler with them, but he would watch the sky over Normandy and wonder who would fly over Moscow next. The Soviet Union had its own skies to command. From the burning fields outside Moscow to the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the Red Air Force had clawed its way from near ruin to dominance, not by design, but by necessity. When the Germans invaded in 1941, they destroyed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft in the first days alone. Runways were shattered, pilots burned alive in their cockpits, squadrons scattered like crows before a storm. But the Soviet answer wasn't retreat, it was replacement, and it came fast. New factories rose beyond the Urals. Women assembled engines with frostbitten fingers. Boys too young to shave were trained to fly Yak-1s and Lad GG-3s through skies laced with tracers. The Red Air Force became a machine that bled, but never stopped flying. By 1943, it was no longer just surviving, it was winning. At Kursk, Soviet pilots held their ground against seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. At Kharkov and the Dnieper, they flew in support of tank armies pushing west. The air war was shifting, and the Soviet aircraft, crude, rugged, aggressive, were doing what they were built for, killing Germans over Soviet soil. But as the Allies bombed France and P-51 Mustangs prowled the skies above Normandy, a quiet tension settled over Soviet command. They respected what they saw, and they envied it. From their watch posts in Poland and Romania, Soviet air observers sent back daily dispatches. They logged Mustang patrols, bombing sorties, the exact timing of air cover rotation. They counted the number of fighters per formation, calculated fuel range, watched how ground forces moved only after the sky had been secured. It was efficient, mechanical, devastating. What struck Soviet analysts most wasn't the Mustang's speed, or its guns, or even its range. It was the rhythm. American air operations were conducted with an industrial tempo: morning strikes, afternoon sweeps, evening reconnaissance, refuel, repeat. There were always planes in the air, always pilots ready, always another wave. It reminded some Soviet commanders not of a military campaign, but of a conveyor belt. Marshal Novikov described it in a closed meeting. They do not improvise as we do. They execute. They calculate. They apply pressure the way a press smashes metal, steadily, without hesitation, until the shape of the battlefield bends to match. But there was skepticism too. Soviet pilots who had fought in the East scoffed at the idea of clean kills from long range. Their war had been one of close quarters, dogfights at treetop height, gun barrels glowing red, aircraft patched with scrap metal and still flying. In their minds, courage mattered more than fuel tanks. One Soviet ace, Captain Ivan Grigoriev, said after watching American Mustangs return from a mission, "They fly like kings, but only because no one's shooting back. Let them come over Kursk in '43 and see how long they last." Still, even Grigoriev admitted the truth. The Americans now owned the sky over France. And not just with fighters. The Red Air Force had no true counterpart to the B-17 Flying Fortress or the British Lancaster. Their bombing force, while improving, was limited to shorter-range operations. Precision raids over enemy territory were rare. Strategic bombing, the kind that destroyed German industry and paralyzed troop movements, was something the Soviets could admire, but not replicate. Stalin knew this. So did his generals. The West could now project power through air, not just respond to it. And that changed the nature of the alliance. Because while the Red Army was pushing across Ukraine, grinding down German divisions one village at a time, the Americans were burning factories in Hamburg and halting panzer movements from the clouds. It was a different kind of war, and it raised a different kind of question. What would happen when the war was over? Would the Mustangs still patrol the skies of Europe? Would the bombers find new targets farther east? Would the Soviets ever match the scale, the reach, the relentless rhythm of the American air machine? Stalin didn't speak of it openly, but in the months following Normandy, Soviet aviation programs were quietly accelerated. Jet prototypes that had sat dormant for months were rushed back into testing. Fuel reserve projects were expanded. New air bases were planned closer to Eastern European borders. The lesson was clear. What the Allies did in Normandy had been impressive, but it was also a warning. Not all skies would remain friendly. The P-51 Mustang, once just a symbol of Allied cooperation, was now something more. A benchmark, a message, a silver line in the sky that reminded Moscow. The war might be ending, but the competition had only just begun. It began with a handshake and ended with suspicion. In early 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe and the Red Army surged westward, the Americans proposed something that had never been done before: long-range shuttle bombing from Soviet soil. It was called Operation Frantic. The idea was simple, almost elegant. American bombers would take off from airfields in England or Italy, strike deep targets in Nazi-occupied Europe, and instead of turning back, they would continue east, landing at air bases inside the Soviet Union. After rest, repairs, and refueling, they would hit new targets on the return flight, either back to the west or onward to the next Soviet base. It would be the first time American heavy bombers operated directly from Soviet territory, and it required something far more fragile than an aircraft: trust. Stalin hesitated. Allowing Western bombers to operate from within the USSR meant exposing Soviet infrastructure, command structure, and the true state of Red Air Force logistics. It meant admitting that the Allies could reach the Soviet heartland not only with permission, but, if one day necessary, without it. Still, the benefits were tempting. For Stalin, it meant more bombs falling on German factories, railways, and oil depots, weakening the Wehrmacht from above, while the Red Army smashed it from below. For the Americans, it meant pressure on Berlin, on the Eastern Front, and on the shape of post-war Europe. So the answer came. Da. But with conditions. The Americans would be allowed to use 3 Soviet airfields, all in Ukraine: Poltava, Mirgorod, and Pyatyn. The Soviets would provide ground support, fuel, security. The mission would be joint, though Soviet personnel were to be excluded from the flight crews and targeting decisions. For a moment, it seemed like cooperation had found its highest altitude yet. The first shuttle mission launched in June 1944. Bombers struck railway yards in Hungary, then landed in Poltava. Local Soviet units welcomed the Americans with formal salutes, red banners, folk songs, and handshakes, captured by both Pravda photographers and U.S. military press. Crews were stunned by what they saw. The airfields were functional but primitive, tents instead of barracks, fuel stored in barrels. Security was light, anti-aircraft defenses minimal, but the warmth of the Soviet soldiers and the vodka helped smooth the edges. The Americans brought candy, soap, magazines. The Soviets responded with black bread, preserved meat, and an endless curiosity. Hands pointed to Mustang fighters and called them Krasivo. American engineers examined Yak-9s and marveled at how they could run with so little. For a moment, 2 worlds stood side by side in the open fields of Ukraine, allies in steel, if not in mind. Then came the night, June 21st, 1944. The sirens at Poltava began just after midnight. The Luftwaffe had found them. German bombers, guided by flares and radio beacons, descended on the sleeping base. The Soviet air defenses responded too slowly. The flak was light, scattered, inaccurate. Within 20 minutes, over 40 American B-17s were destroyed or gutted by fire. Fuel trucks exploded. Ammunition dumps ignited. Crews scrambled into ditches as waves of fire swept the runway. The next morning, smoke still curled from twisted wreckage. The runway shimmered with melted aluminum. Charred wings jutted from craters like blackened bones. It was the worst ground loss of American aircraft in Europe. The Americans were furious. They demanded to know why the Soviet anti-aircraft guns hadn't responded in time, why night fighter squadrons had failed to intercept, why the Germans had met no resistance. The Soviet response was flat, bureaucratic, and vague. Delays, confusion, miscommunication, perhaps sabotage. But the truth was clear, even if no one said it aloud. The trust had cracked. Operation Frantic continued, but the mood changed. Later shuttle missions flew with increased caution, fewer aircraft, and tighter control. American crews were restricted from wandering the bases. Soviet officers watched every movement. Jokes became formalities, smiles, thinner. One American pilot described the atmosphere. "We flew halfway around the world to fight a common enemy, and landed among men who already looked at us like future rivals." And he wasn't wrong, because by late 1944, both sides were already looking past Hitler. The Americans saw Europe divided between bombers and boots. The Soviets saw a continent to be rebuilt and controlled, one liberated city at a time. And above them, the skies were already shifting. The Mustangs, the fortresses, the Yaks, the Lavochkins. They were no longer just tools of war. They were flags, statements, warnings written in vapor trails and engine smoke. Operation Frantic had proven that Allied cooperation could stretch across continents. It had also proven how quickly it could snap. And when the last B-17 lifted off from Poltava, its bomb bay empty, its wings still blackened from ash, the war still raged on. But a new battle, colder, quieter, and much longer, had already begun. In war, there are moments when history bends, not from speeches or treaties, but from force, from metal, from speed, from sky. In Normandy, June 1944, the sky bent. The first troops had landed. Beaches had been taken. But the real battle, the one that would decide whether the Allies could break out from the narrow coastal strip, was only beginning. And the Germans, though stunned, were not defeated. Not yet. They moved fast. Reinforcements rolled in from Brittany, from the Pas de Calais, even from the Eastern Front. SS Panzer divisions, mobile artillery, armored columns meant to hammer the Allied beachhead back into the sea. It might have worked. But then, the sky opened, and the Mustangs returned. This wasn't a mission. It was a campaign. sustained, merciless, and without pause. P-51s, joined by thunderbolts and typhoons, flew in shifts that never stopped. From dawn until dusk, the air was filled with screaming engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the terrible whine of rockets. The objective was simple. Do not let the Germans move. Every road was a target, every rail line, every fuel truck, every column of tanks. The Allied air forces, British, American, Canadian, and even a few Free French, blanketed the region with air power so overwhelming that Wehrmacht officers began ordering troops to move only at night, and even then, only in small, scattered groups. But night brought no safety. The RAF Mosquitoes came then, with pinpoint raids and radar-guided strikes. There was nowhere to hide. Barns used to shelter vehicles were bombed. Forest roads turned to mud from crater impacts. Bridges vanished. Convoys burned. The Germans began digging fake ditches beside real ones, trying to confuse aerial reconnaissance. It didn't work. Pilots flew so low they could smell the smoke. They memorized terrain. They hunted by habit. One German major, interviewed after the war, said simply, "We did not fear tanks. We feared the sky." At the center of it all were the P-51 Mustangs, now operating from forward bases inside France. Their fuel tanks were lighter, their armament heavier, their missions faster. They were no longer escorts, they were executioners. German anti-aircraft crews tried to adapt. Flat cannons were repositioned, camouflaged, hidden inside haystacks. But the Mustangs learned to spot the muzzle flash before the shell left the barrel. Losses on both sides mounted. Pilots crashed into forests, into farms, into rivers. Some survived, others didn't. But the rhythm continued, a relentless wave of steel from the air that broke the German ability to maneuver. In one day alone, July 18, 1944, as Operation Goodwood launched toward Caen, Allied air forces flew over 2,000 sorties. Entire tank formations were spotted, struck, and shattered before reaching the front line. Columns became wreckage. Roads became cemeteries. One German unit, Panzer Lehr, among the best armored formations in the Wehrmacht, lost over half its vehicles before firing a shot. The damage was not only physical, it was psychological. German soldiers stopped trusting movement. Officers hesitated to issue orders during daylight. Communication slowed. Frontline units waited for supplies that never came. Fuel ran dry. Morale cracked. And on the other side of the lines, the Allies advanced. Slowly at first. Bloody. Hedgerow by hedgerow. But without the threat of German reinforcements moving freely, the shape of the battlefield shifted. American and British tanks no longer feared a counter-thrust from behind. Infantry pushed forward, knowing the enemy supply lines were choking. All because of the air. All because of Mustangs and their partners in the sky. Even Soviet observers stationed in Allied command posts, their presence quietly tolerated for political purposes, sent home stunned reports. Anglo-American aircraft maintain absolute control, one Soviet colonel wrote. No German unit larger than a platoon can move without being targeted. In Moscow, the Red Army read the reports carefully. This was more than just a Western success. It was a glimpse into the future. A world where air dominance didn't just support ground operations, it decided them. And Normandy had proven the model. The firestorm in the French skies wasn't a show of strength. It was the new doctrine of war. Coordinated air-ground operations, real-time reconnaissance, instant suppression of enemy movement. And the Mustang, fast, long-range, lethal, had become the spearhead of that doctrine. By August, the Germans were retreating across France, broken and bleeding. Their mechanized dreams left burning on shattered roads. And the Allies? They advanced beneath wings. The P-51 had once been designed as a temporary solution. Now it was writing the future, in gunfire and contrails, one village at a time.